You may not want to hear this, but it is important that you do. We're in the midst of finding out that the global social experiment of following our bliss made possible by new technologies is actually tearing us apart, and Jordan Peterson just gave society that vital reality check on the subject of sex and relationships. As endless progressivism around sexual dynamics lands us at a dead end, these next few clips are the bitter antidote to the diet of impulsive pleasures that too many people today have gotten used to. Watch this before I tell you.
So my question is, as a redeemed progressive, what is the key to empowering men in the Me Too age while maintaining healthy boundaries and strong behavioral expectations?
We've had relatively reliable birth control since 1960. Okay, that's not very long. And we underestimate the unbelievable technological triumph of birth control. It's the hydrogen bomb, it's the transistor, like it's a major league transformation in human interaction. Women are now free from involuntary reproduction. That's never been the case in the entire history of the planet. Okay, we don't know exactly what to do about that. Okay, so the first idea in the 60s was, hell, let's party. And you could see why. It's like what the rules for not engaging in promiscuous sexual intercourse seemed to have vanished. So we had a couple of decades of experimentation. It's like, well, how'd that go? Little hard on the family, I would say. That's not so good for kids. AIDS, that wasn't a plus. Could have killed us all. And it mutated, particularly to take advantage of promiscuous sex, because viruses are very tricky things. So it turns out that sex is a little bit more complicated than we thought. Well, it actually turns out that it's a lot more complicated than we think. Okay, and now it's 50, 60 years later, and we're trying to sort this out. It's like, well, when is it okay to have sex? Exactly. And when is it not okay to have sex? And what does it mean that it's okay? And what does consent mean? And the answer to that is, well, we never used to have to think these things through, because the rule was don't have sex until you get married. That was the rule. Now that isn't the rule. Okay, so what's the rule? Well, we're not having a conversation about the rule. We're waiting till someone does something that seems like it might be untoward and then mobbing them and trying to extract the rule out that way. And it's not a very effective way of doing it.
You know what I think? We have a tendency today to attribute many of our societal changes around gender relations to movements and social uprisings like feminism without realizing that there are some changes whose time has simply come. And in this case, things like technology and the economy have had a much greater impact in enabling those changes that we instead credit to social movements. By the way, we have important discussions like this every day, so please do consider subscribing. Now, here's the truth about sex and relationships. For all of human history, they've been undergirded by the harsh pragmatics of life, where children and the family unit were pivotal to survival. It's only in the modern coddled world where we can even afford building relationships and sexuality on the flimsy foundations of passion, love, and fulfillment. And it's this distinction that you can see throughout the human race until the moment that the birth control pill in the 1960s removed sex from the core of committed relationships and marriage. Let me give you some vital statistics to put this into perspective. A study conducted out of the UK a few years ago revealed a startling fact about sexual promiscuity. In much of the Western world, young women today have 3 times as many sexual partners at the age of 24 than their grandmothers did in the 1960s. The average partner count had increased from 1.67 in the 60s to 3.72 in the 80s, and it's nearly 5.7 today. That's an exponential rise that has a reverberating impact across society that not enough people are ready to talk about. And that's the average, which means half are even higher. The result of sex being largely removed from the core of committed relationships to something of a recreation is only made possible by the technology that enables it. Imagine a whole framework of structure around sexual dynamics that had built itself up over centuries of tradition, dissolving and surrendering to the sexual impulses of young people that very little care for its impact moving forward. And as it turns out, society's having a really hard time grappling with this disorienting degree of new sexual freedom.
You know, you want to decrease campus? That's easy. Get rid of alcohol. No one has that conversation. It's like I did my PhD work on alcohol. 50% of the people who are murdered are drunk, and 50% of the people who kill them are drunk. And almost all the date situations are consequences of excess intoxication. But yet there's a party culture on campuses and anything goes. And you also have this strange thing, especially on the radical left, which is unbelievably paradoxical, where absolutely every form of sexual expression imaginable is 100% permissible because sex is fine, but it's so dangerous that while you're dancing with someone at a Princeton mixer, you have to ask them 2 or 3 times if it's okay for you to continue. And that's actually the case, by the way. I'm not making that up. It's like, well, both of those things can't be true. Now, what's happening, I think, on the Me Too end of things and the affirmative consent end of things is the old sexual taboos are reasserting themselves. Mm-hmm. The idea that we can extract sex out from emotional intimacy, and especially emotional intimacy, I would say, psychological intimacy, maybe even from long-term relationship, I don't believe it's a tenable idea. I don't think we can do it. And a lot of what we're seeing is the backlash against that. It's like, well, I feel used. You know, because one of the things that's happening on the really radical end of the anti-sexual abuse movement is the idea that, well, if you have intercourse with someone and then you regret it the next day, that's evidence that it wasn't consensual. Well, it is, in a sense, evidence that it wasn't consensual, because it's evidence that you didn't bloody well think it through, right? It was good for last night, but it's not good for today. It's not very wise. The question is, well, what constitutes consent? And we need to have a very serious conversation about that. Like, under what circumstances is it acceptable to give consent? But we're not mature enough to have that conversation. We want it both ways. We want to be able to do whatever we want, with whoever we want, whenever we want, with no consequences, and we want there never to be any trouble about consent. It's like, well, no, that's not going to happen. I don't think that sex works very well outside of committed relationships. I don't think there's any evidence that it does. There's a strong proclivity across cultures for the enforcement, social enforcement of long-term monogamy. And there's reasons for that. And I think you deviate from that at your peril.
Honestly, what else did we expect? When something as powerful and sacred as human sexuality, which can create children and is riddled with all sorts of emotional and biological dangers, is simply rendered into a free-for-all match on the basis of some ill-defined consent, how could we not expect some people to trample over these new moral tripwires? I should mention here that when I say sexual freedom, it tends to sound better than it really is on a societal level. Here's a statistic that surprised me and will surprise you. In the United States now, more than 63% of young men under the age of 30 report being single. That's 2 in every 3 guys you meet who's not just failing to find a committed relationship, but also struggling to have all the fun that supposedly comes from participating in modern hookup culture and the short-term flings. That means you're stuck in the middle of the 2 eras, working dead-end jobs and not having a family to do it for. No matter how you choose to look at it, it is undeniable how dangerous that it is for society that is already in a volatile state as it is today. It's sometimes said that the most dangerous thing in the world is a man with nothing to lose, and we may be producing too many of such men in the modern world as we set sexuality free from all constraints and commitments that used to give it a purpose. If you read Jordan Peterson's most popular book, 12 Rules for Life, that came out in 2018, you'll probably also remember how there was a controversy around that time when much of the digital print media misconstrued Jordan's idea of wanting enforced monogamy. In other words, it's a burden of societal expectations that Jordan believed every young person should feel when they step out into the world of sex and dating, that there would actually be a long-term committed relationship that would come out of it. And looking at how wrong the social experiment of complete sexual freedom can go, even the modern left is trying to claw at some kind of new structure and rulebook around sex after tearing down the existing one over the last 6 decades.
My sense also as a clinician is, you only really get to try out about 5 people in your life. You have to make a decision pretty damn quick. Like between 20 and 30, there's a lot of things to get straight, and long-term mate is usually one of them. And most of the time, people should be more careful with their sexual behavior when they're young, especially when they're drunk, than they are. And I just think it's so interesting that all of the taboo reconstruction is coming from the radical left. It's not what you'd expect at all. You'd think it'd be the damn right-wing Christians complaining about, sexual immorality. It's like, no, it's the radical lefties. You have to have signed consent before making any physical move. And then that's so what? Really? Who thought that up? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. You know how awkward that would be? You're supposed to be able to do a little bit of nonverbal reading, right? I mean, that's part of romance. You ever see a movie where the 2 people who are dating exchange consent notes? Like, that doesn't happen. So it's an unrealistic solution. But I think the real solution is that despite the fact that we have reliable birth control, we're going to have to relearn what the acceptable rules of propriety are with regards to sexual relationships. One of the things I often tell my young clients is don't do anything physically with anyone that you wouldn't talk to them about. Because if you're too damn embarrassed to talk about it, well, maybe it's a little premature in the relationship to actually do it. And then there's harm in it. There's emotional harm in it on both parties. There's the cheapening of both parties. So it's going to take us a long time to sort this out. But hopefully we can do it in a serious manner, and it won't be merely a matter of mobbing those who seem to have made an error.
You see something like the golden rule start to take shape here? When you treat someone else as a casual sex partner, you're actually allowing yourself to be treated casually as well. And there's no way you can keep doing that for long without having it chip away at a part of your self-esteem and emotional health over time. Jordan's last book, Beyond Order, had what I think is one of his most successful rules across his books. Rule 10 says, plan and work diligently to maintain the romance in your relationship. It's where Jordan reveals the true depth and beauty that comes from committed relationships when they're allowed to simmer and evolve. And if you can put in the effort, they can also be the most sexually fulfilling. That's worth more than any fleeting pleasure you'll get from sporadic sexual encounters with people you know. Don't care about you beyond that. I think this conversation that Jordan had in Australia with John Anderson was packed with valuable advice for young people, and there's no one that can salvage old wisdom for them better than Jordan Peterson.